So, as Drew said, I'm Randy Zimmerman, and my email address is at the bottom of the flyer, so you can get in contact with me pretty easily. I want to thank Cheryl Tate for handing over the reins from last year to this year very, very smoothly. The wonderful thing about this is it gave me an opportunity to invite some of my academic heroes and sheroes, which is like really cool. There were so many people who helped at the beginning of today. Thank you very much. Please, a couple of folks stick around, including those who signed up, as well as we're going to pass around this email list for students. Deirdre, you want to stand up? Deirdre is the president of GSAC this year, and the email list will go to her, and I will email you asking for your help for setting up and cleaning up. The ever helpful Colleen McDermott also helped made a lot of this possible, and I want to give her a big thumbs up. But now to introduce our speaker for today is Catherine Lugg. She is professor in the Education Department of Theory, Policy, and Administration right here at the GSE at Rutgers University. Her research interests include educational politics and history and the influences of social movements and political ideology have on educational politics and policy. She's the author of 3 books, For God and Country, Conservatism and American School Policy, as well as Kitsch, From Education to Public Policy. Her forthcoming book, which she'll be discussing today, is U.S. Public Schools and the Politics of Queer Erasure. One faculty member described this as one of the most successful sabbaticals ever. Her honors include the Paul S. Silver Award for Outstanding Article in the Journal of Cases in Educational Leadership, also written with Autumn Toombs, the Scholar Activist Award, which is from AERA, the Queer Studies SIG, and the William J. Davis Award for Outstanding Article in Education Administration Quarterly, also with Autumn Toombs, as well as Ira Botok. The UCEA Service Award and the J.D. Scribner Award, which is a career award for outstanding mentoring of junior scholars. Speaking of which, she also may be the academic mentoring more doctoral students both through graduation and currently than any other faculty member, but that's an unofficial award, so I don't know if I can bestow that. Anyway, please welcome Catherine.
And I really apologize for doing this, but so I don't get in trouble. This is being recorded today. So, and that means, A, you can have the opportunity to look at this. It'll be archived and you can look at it. Also means that anything you say can be used and held against you.
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm just incredibly happy to see everybody here. I want to thank Drew and Randy for helping me get this set up, and to GSAC for providing the space and the food. Title of today's presentation is U.S. Public Schooling and the Politics of Queer Erasure. Does it get any better? This is drawn from my book that's coming out next month. So with Belgrave. Thank you. It was recruited by H.E. Rudd, who's a philosopher of education and very active in social film. The book is a history, and history tends to focus on 2 things. It focuses on the context in which events occur, as well as the actual events themselves or content. My sources. Now the thing is, this is the book I've wanted to write for the last 30 years. So it's based on a history of all things queer in the United States from the 1920s until today. And so my primary sources are books from a given era, like the sociology of teaching, professional journals and newspaper reporting of a given era, governmental reports, blog sites, activist writings, law review articles, court cases, educational movies. Second, and what happened is, starting in 1988, as I would get a book, if I ran across something that was queer, I would underline it and then note the page in the front of the book. And so as my professional library grew and grew, this ad hoc method of keeping track of queer historical sources grew and grew. I also tried to download every PDF I could of articles into my hard drive. So I've got a pretty outrageously large hard drive stuffed with PDFs. I call it the good old underline method. My secondary sources include books, research articles, law review articles, film documentaries, and histories, and some educational research. The thing to remember is educational research is like the last this party. Well, law review literature, psychology literature have, generations of research. It doesn't really get going in education until the 1980s, and in my areas of educational administration and policy, like late 1990s. So it's a very new field. For those of you who care about quantitative research, the book has 351 endnotes. And that's my concession to quantitative research. Conceptual framing, and I could spend like all day today on just talking about the framing, but I'm not going to do it. I draw on queer theory, that identity is inherently unstable, can be hidden and or erased, power is always contested, and the Q word, I've had these ongoing fights, first with my wife and now with AERA, whether you can say queer or not. It's really a reclaiming slur, and I also use it as a form of rhetorical shorthand instead of saying lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersexual, allies, and I'm probably forgetting somebody. But the problem with the word gay is that from the 70s on forward, it really means gay white male of a certain class. And so it's not inclusive at all. And so I really prefer the term queer. I use queer legal theory because I work in the area of politics and policy. And once I tumbled across queer legal theory, and it was devised by Francisco Valdez in 1995, it really made my analytic life a lot easier. Historically, queer identity in the United States has been framed under the three following themes. Heretical. What I mean is that under Western Christianity, and particularly Protestantism in the United States, to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, you are at violation with some what were thought basic tenets of the church. And so that identity was heretical. And if you see on the politics of it, it's really religiously based, some of the anti-queer stuff. It's also criminal, starting in the 1920s. In particular, same-sex sexual behavior and actually how you dress became criminalized in all 48 and then 50 states. And, of course, pathological. Homosexuality was seen as a dangerous mental illness, also bisexuality and being transgender. Queer identity starts to become normalized in 1973-74 when the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court in Lawrence v. Texas decriminalized same-gender or same-sex consensual sex. That said, sodomy laws are still on the books in 12 states. So when my wife and I go down to visit her family in Columbia, South Carolina, we both have licenses. She's a social worker. I have my Commonwealth of Pennsylvania teaching certificate, and we become at risk because we are technically known as statutory felons. The heretical charge remains. If you all watch what was going on in Kentucky about gay marriage and Kim Davis, she is claiming religious privilege, saying it violates her religious norms. Queer identity is antithetical to her identity, so she's not going to crank out marriage certificates. So much for the 14th Amendment. Since the 1920s, I argue that the U.S. public schools have increasingly focused on erasing all things that are queer or that could be suspected of queer. And as I run to my little treasure trove that is backed up in at least 3 different spots, this is the earliest article I could find. It's from the Journal of Educational Sociology. It's Agnes M. Conklin. And she's talking about students in urban high schools. And she argues that some students will have or will develop sexual maladjustments, failure to pass through puberty successfully, hangovers of homosexuality. At this time, sexual development was thought that everybody was homosexual at some point, and then you grew out of it. Persistence of infantile dependencies and a host of warped viewpoints due to improper knowledge vicariously acquired. But so she's basically making this argument that if you have queer kids, well, you can't fix them, get rid of them. Willard Waller, who is one of the fathers, beloved fathers of educational sociology, has this gem of a quote in his The Sociology of Teaching. Nothing seems more certain than homosexuality is contagious. And I actually wanted to use homosexuality is contagious for my title of the book. But the publisher had kittens, so I decided to not persist in that argument. And he's arguing in The Sociology of Education that schools, and particularly principals, aggressively weed out queers. That if you're going to be serious about character education, you're going to have to produce individuals who are normally heterosexual. And he has a whole thing about how queer teachers in particular are just really a horrible thing to have. Interesting is that his book is revisited in 1988. When he wrote the book, he was associate professor of sociology at Penn State, my alma mater, hurts. And then UCEA issued a book in 1988 called Revisiting Willard Waller. There's an article in AERJ in 2012 about revisiting Willard Waller and how to use his sociological observations for contemporary analysis. Both texts ignore the homophobia. I mean, they don't mention it at all, like it's not there, but it's pretty striking. And it remains a standard in the sociology of education literature. Again, in the 20s and the 30s, you have the rise of sodomy laws. You also have increasing requirements for certification of teachers and principals and superintendents. And again, you can't hold a license. You can't hold a professional license if you are a convicted felon, and then you have these offenses like sodomy that criminalize an entire class of people, and you become what William Eskridge has said is statutory felon. And so this is now puts pressure on schools of education to start weeding out suspected queer teachers. And they use gender as a proxy for orientation. Teachers must be gender conforming. When I student taught in 1985 in Elmira, New York, in elementary and junior high, senior high, instrumental music. You can't imagine how bizarre it is to teach sixth graders how to play the tuba in hose, heels, and a skirt. It's just not a ladylike position. But there's a lot of pressure to be gender conforming. And who's done a lot of terrific work on this is Jackie Blom. There's a push in the 1930s because there's a lot of public worry about that we have so many women as teachers. We're gonna, our boys are gonna be sissified. They're just gonna be, it's gonna be trouble. They're gonna turn out to be queer. Oh, we gotta hire more guys. Well, it's the Depression. And during this time, we didn't have equal employment laws, so you didn't have to pay women a living wage. My late grandmother was a teacher during this time. She was a widow, and she never got paid the same as men. It was one of the lasting irritants throughout her life that there was no such thing as pay equity. You have World War II, where there's a relaxation of this anti-queer stuff. But then you have the Cold War. And the slur of the time is commie, pinko, queer. And there's this notion that if you are queer, that you are a threat, an existential threat to the nation state. So you have the conflation of queer identity with communism. So what's wild is you have these spectacular witch hunts, starting in the State Department, going to the Department of Defense. The FBI is trying to ferret out queers. It filters down to the states. You have Karen Graves has this heartbreaking book called And They Were Wonderful Teachers. And the state of Florida really went cuckoo and hunted down queer teachers and trapped them. Said if you rat out your friends, you'll keep your license. Of course, nobody kept their license. And it's really shaped, particularly teacher ed, in a long time. Just a bit of irony is, of course, you have the FBI going after queer people, but of course, anybody know the story on J. Edgar, affectionately known as High Heels Hoover? Yeah, and so it gets very crazy. Meanwhile, the Communist Party of the United States is also throwing out their queer members because they're worried about blackmail. So you can't stay in the U.S. government, but you can't stay in the Communist Party for the same reasons. It's one of these weird points of historical convergence. Just a person who was a kid during this time says, we were also closeted, and it was so illegal to be queer. You could be put in jail and put into mental hospitals. Meryl Mushroom is a longtime Southern lesbian activist. She just got married. But standard medical treatments during the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s were electroshock, lobotomy, and castration. Occasionally frontal lobotomy. BYU actually continued to use electric shock until the early 2000s for on their students. Pardon? It was an era of incredible violence. This is actually from a police officer from 1951. Now, in my own case, when I catch a guy like that, I just pick him up and take him into the woods and beat him until he can't crawl. I've had 17 cases like that in the last couple of years. I tell the guy if I catch him doing that again, I will take him out to the woods and I will shoot him. I tell him I carry a second gun on me just in case I find guys like him, and that I will plant it in his hand and say that he tried to kill me, and then no jury will convict me. He was free to tell a sociologist this. Whoops, wrong button. One teacher who was outed, it's just anecdotal, but she married a gay man, always brought him to faculty parties, and made sure everyone knew to address her as Mrs. She came to school in dresses, hose, and high heels. You all have Google, you all have computers, you all can access YouTube. Boys Beware is an educational film made by the Englewood Public School District and the Englewood, California Police Department. They made it in 1963 as a black and white. They reshot it in 73 using different actors and colored film. And one of the, it's like the voice of God as narration. What Jimmy didn't know, that Ralph was sick. A sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious. Again, this notion that queer identity is contagious. A sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual. A person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. One never knows when the homosexual was about. So, it's these lurking, menacing queers. He may appear normal, and it may be too late when you discover he is mentally ill. But this is a school district. This is a public school district, a fairly large one in California. And in 73, instead of saying, oh, this was a really bad idea, APA just changed things, they're like, no, let's do it again. Good news for us as researchers is the film is off copyright. So you can go home, upload it, and watch the whole thing. It's kind of a hoot, and then when you realize people took it seriously, it's a little disturbing. The 1970s. In the 1970s, it's post-Stonewall. Stonewall was the riot that was 1969 that took place in a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City. Most contemporary histories actually start, when I talk about the contemporary era, start with Stonewall. I actually don't. Because a bar fight is kind of like a weird spot to start in educational history. It's kind of in but I start with the change in APA in 1973. This gentleman, I'm asked, would homosexual teachers influence children? Of course they would. This guy's a former superintendent. He's writing in the Phi Delta Captain in 1977. The PDK had a special issue on gay teachers. And he's arguing that it's just a really bad idea that teachers come out. Because teachers are coming out in the 70s. The thing is, the law's not on their side. In about half the states, your identity is still criminalized. There are no discrimination laws at the state level. And you start seeing an upsurge in anti-queer laws targeting public school educators. In 1975, the state of California rescinds their sodomy laws. And in 78, you have Proposition 6, which was a referendum at the state of California trying to bar not only all queer teachers, but if you had made any kind of pro-queer speech yourself and you're non-queer, you could lose your job and your license as well. What kept this from being passed is that great queer liberator Ronald Reagan came out and said, this goes too far, it's going to be endless litigation, it's bad public policy, and it went down to defeat, in some places 2-1. Oklahoma, however, did pass it same year, and that was eventually tossed out by the Supreme Court in 1983. You also had local attacks. So in New Jersey, there was a guy by the name of John Gish. He was active in the Gay Activist Alliance, which, by the way, still exists up in Morristown. He was president of it, and his school board, of course, found out because he was being very public, and they tried to get him fired. He had to undergo a psychiatric exam, I think in either 72 or 73, and it was ongoing litigation. He was a tenured teacher, and they eventually got him. And he lost his job and his license. In the post-Stonewall era, teachers are very vulnerable. And then you have the AIDS crisis. And what HIV/AIDS does is it forces many gay men out of the closet because the disease is so spectacularly lethal. You can't hide your identity because you're sick. But it also increased political activism as and it has people coming out, including public school students. I know I'm galloping through a lot of history, so deep breath. Bowers v. Hardwick. This is the U.S. Supreme Court case in 1986 that states were free to criminalize same-sex consensual behavior. I know you've all got oodles of free time at the beginning of the school year. Read Bowers v. Hardwick. The decision-making is just pretty awful. And so one of the observations I had is, and other legal scholars have noted, that in the U.S., laws regarding sexual behavior have always been tangled up with identity. So you have laws against cross-race sex, queer sex, premarital sex, and it's a way of criminalizing identity. The meaning of Bowers was that queer identity would remain criminalized in about half of the U.S. states, and that queer public educators remained in danger of losing their jobs, their licenses, in some locales being jailed. Again, this is the statutory felon. During the HIV/AIDS crisis, you have an explosion of violence targeting gay men and lesbians. One scholar pointed out that you had a lot of gay bashing. It was very predatory, and it's the byproduct of pervasive anti-gay governmental discrimination. The record of dismemberment, torture, and destruction of the bodies of gay and lesbian men is one that would not be tolerated if the members were political majorities. And for those of us who remember, this is when ACT UP would wear this t-shirt that said silence equals death. They weren't being cute about it. That said, in the midst of the AIDS crisis, you have the Surgeon General's report. And he argues, this is C. Everett Koop, who was an evangelical and a strong anti-abortion proponent, but he said, given the sheer lethality of AIDS, and there were no really decent treatments till 1996, we've got to start education about AIDS at the lowest grade possible. So the same year you have Bowers, it's the same year the Surgeon General's report is released on AIDS. You also have a lot of activism at this time. You have ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Release Power. You have Queer Nation. You have the Lesbian Avengers. And what is happening in the 80s and 90s is the HIV/AIDS crisis and the non-response by the U.S. federal government radicalized several generations of scholars, one of whom you might know. Toward the end of the 80s, you have the Gibson report. And this was part of a much larger HHS study on youth suicide. This is during the first Bush administration. And what Paul Gibson wrote on gay youth is that he noted that gay youth face extreme physical and verbal abuse, rejection, isolation from family and peers. They often feel totally alone and socially withdraw out of fear of adverse consequences. As a result of these pressures, lesbian and gay youth are more vulnerable than other youth to psychosocial problems, including substance abuse, chronic depression, school failure, early relationship conflicts, being forced to leave their families, and having to survive on their own prematurely. Each of these problems presents a risk factor for suicidal feelings and behavior. And this is the first time we have data saying that gay youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than other young people. They may comprise up to 30% of completed suicides annually. The thing is, did we know about this in 1989? We did not. The Bush administration suppressed the report, and it was never published by the U.S. federal government. It wasn't until the Clinton administration came in and released the hold on it that Gary Rebafati got it published through Allison Publications. The head of Health and Human Services was Louis Sullivan, and he was very involved with the Protestant right, and actually he was looking at a grant for reparative therapy, which is the fraudulent effort to turn queer people into non-queer people. The recommendations, you can see why they were going to be, the report was going to be suppressed though. Public and private schools need to take responsibility for providing all students at the junior and high school level with positive information about homosexuality. Given Louis Sullivan's relationship with the Protestant right, that sentence killed the whole thing. Curriculum material should include blah, blah, blah. You also, because you have increasing queer visibility and increasingly youth visibility coming out, you start to see a shift in anti-queer politics. Beginning in the 1990s, and this is after a series of court losses at the state level, the anti-queer movement moved from solely focusing on queer adults, long and target, to increasingly public schools. This is where the time where you start seeing pushes for abstinence-only education that only will not talk about queer kids. This is where you have the rise of no promo homo laws, or laws banning the promotion of homosexuality in the public schools. Now, I'd like to see where that was actually happening, but it was, just a target. This means that queer children became the new targets of anti-queer activists. And the politics get more ferocious. You had the rise of GSAs in the 1980s. These are gay-straight alliances. These were made legally permissible under the Equal Rights Act of 1984, passed by the great queer liberator Ronald Reagan. But what the Supreme Court ruled in Mergens versus Westside in, I think 1991, they said basically if you have a limited or open public forum in your schools, if you have a football team, if you have a chess club, you can't ban the GSA. And the EAA was actually passed to open up schools to Bible clubs. So it's got this really interesting paradoxical history, which I can talk on about all night, but I shan't. 1992 is also, you have the Colorado Amendment 2, which strips queers of all civil rights protections, especially the right to petition government for redress of grievances. It was a really sweeping law. It was thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court in Romer v. Evans in 1996. And for the first time, the Supreme Court ruled that you could not make queer people strangers to their own country. It's the first time the Supreme Court takes a very strong stand, and that court case is authored by William Kennedy, who was the replacement for Robert Bork when Bork was shot down by the Senate. The politics gets more ferocious. You've got GSAs, kids are coming out, and you have folks, various activists saying homosexual activists are deadly serious about using the education process to teach kids that homosexuality is okay, and that anyone else who thinks otherwise is a bigot. You have, this is a classic that I've seen over 50 years. Homosexuals can't reproduce, so they recruit. So of course, you know, one of the pro-queer chants of 1990s was 10% is not enough, recruit, recruit, recruit. But that's just waving a red flag to a bull. And this person is saying that they're not going to use high schools and junior high schools to recruit. So you have the rise of no promo homo laws and abstinence only education. And what's interesting is, you know, it's abstinence only until marriage. And of course, queer people until 2015 could not get married in all 50 states. The no promo homo laws and policies, these ban, as I said earlier, the explicit positive mention of homosexuality and queer identity and the like. That said, negative associations are fine. So like in Texas, if you say homosexual, you have to say it's against the law in Texas, even though Texas lost in Lawrence v. Texas. The law is still in place. And that it leads to dysfunctional it's going to make you sick, pathological. These laws and policies, which are still in the books, keep educators from intervening in anti-queer bullying and violence. One of the things that's happened is that queer kids are increasingly visible. So in 1991, the age that gay men and lesbians and bisexual people usually came out was 25. By 2011, that age had fallen to 16. Furthermore, researchers discovered that the age when a child was aware of their LGBT but not T identity was between 8 and 9 years old. So we're talking elementary school. Which, if you know, as we talk to our colleagues who teach in public schools, they're like, yeah, I've got, you know, third graders coming out. If nothing else, the age and awareness and the age of sexual identity has fallen from nearly a 20-year gap to about 8 years. Which is just shh. So if someone's saying, oh, we're a public school, we can't deal with this, it's like, oh yeah, you're gonna have to. It's your reality. But visibly queer kids make them a target. So in Anoka Hennepin, which had no promo homo law, and Jason Murphy and I've written on this, what happened is it was so aggressively enforced that you ended up with a suicide cluster, where queer kids or kids who were presumed to be queer were killing themselves, to the point where the U.S. Department of Justice intervened in 2012. And so you had this quote, no one would come to her aid for fear of violating the district-wide policy, requiring school personnel to stay neutral on issues of homosexuality. All Brittany knew was that she was on her own, vulnerable and ashamed, and she later committed suicide. This happened in Pennsylvania this spring. We came into school on Thursday and we found a lot of people wearing flannel. We couldn't figure out why. people started getting pushed and notes were left on people's lockers. I got called a dyke, a faggot. They were calling us every horrible name you could think of. It was an unofficial anti-gay day. And so the jocks all dressed up in flannel t-shirts and went after all the queer kids. And I argue in the book that there's actually a culture comp on queer children, or culture war, in a very Bismarckian sense, in that you want to erase the presence of queer people. Whoops, I went the wrong way. Oh, jeez. I'm being tortured. Just go away. See, advocates firmly believe that identity is catching, going back to Willard Waller. Hence, queer identity must be eradicated. If that means queer students are hurt, then this is what drives me crazy. Advocates are okay with this. And what happens is they say, well, the kid was depressed, and that's why they committed suicide. Or, you know, the kid is, you know, it's because they're gay that they're depressed and they're going to commit suicide, or it's because they're trans, and, you know, it's just, it's intrinsic pathology here. That's the argument they're making. There's also just a lot of lies being told. And last point is that public schooling is the last domain where one can consistently vote one's homophobic preferences, because we vote for school boards. And sometimes you vote for state boards of education, or they're appointed by your governor. And that can be really problematic. It's not just Texas. And this notion can be racialized and televised, and it just amps the hate even further. So this was from TV Sweeps Week in 2007, alleging the existence of black lesbian gangs that sexually prey on young heterosexual women. The story featured a staged dramatization of fictitious bathroom assaults. The source for this otherwise baseless report was a Shelby County, Tennessee gang unit officer who claimed lesbian gang members were anally raping heterosexual girls with sex toys and were more violent than any boys she had encountered, and were in all our schools. So, you know, this is really inciting fear and violence, both racial violence, sexual identity violence against children. And this is from a nice little law book, Queer Injustice, the criminalization of LGBT people in the United States, you know, in all your free time. But it's a dandy text. Then we have GLSEN reports. And again, the data from GLSEN, who started surveying, and you can, you know, and there are problems with the methodology, but they're the only group that's been consistently publishing on rates of violence and harassment since 1999. And the data have been consistent and have been dismal. 3 out of 4 queer kids experience violence in their public school, high rates of verbal harassment in some locales, 90%. Some of the abusers are teachers and administrators, and so forth. And Gibson pegged the suicide rates for gay kids to 2 to 3 times the general population. It's now looking like it's actually 3 to 5 times the general population. It's awfully hard to get at the trans suicide rate, which is probably even higher. I'm arguing that there's another way of seeing things. And I'm going to take a side issue. You have Mohammed Barzani in the start of the Arab Spring. Barzani was a fruit seller in Tunis. And he was repeatedly harassed by the cops, you know, beaten up, his money stolen, his fruit stolen. And he didn't have a voice. He couldn't feel like he could complain to anyone. And he just got, you know, continually harassed. And so in December of 2011, he poured kerosene over himself and set himself on fire. And that supposedly is the trigger for the Arab Spring. You start seeing governments in the Middle East falling at quite a pace, you know, these very brutal authoritarian governments. And his actions were seen as explicitly a political act. of giving voice to his grievances that had been ignored until he set himself on fire. One of the less pleasant things I did for this book was I started going through suicide notes. Because historically, suicide in some instances is manifestly a political act. So you have Leila Acorn, who threw herself in front of a tractor trailer right before Christmas last December, trans kid. And she wrote, "My death needs to mean something. My death needs to be counted in the number of transgender people who commit suicide this year. I want someone to look at that number and say, that's fucked up, and fix it. Fix society, please." Now, you could read this, as some of my colleagues in AERA would, that, oh, poor, tortured, dysfunctional, depressed child. But what she's saying is that she's being oppressed. This is political oppression. She doesn't have a voice. And it's the politics, to paraphrase an old campaign slogan. And children in the United States and young adults do not have a political voice until they're 18. And of course, PowerPoint is making me crazy. And we have this danger of the poor, tortured queer men. AERA had a Capitol Hill briefing session in July. And much of the session was spent on, well, look at the rates of suicide and victimization and bullying of queer kids, and we can get grants, mental health grants to further point out how tortured they are. And I'm like, well, great, but that's not going to change anything. You're reinforcing the pathological frame. And it treads very close to being victim blaming. It also lets non-queer adults off the hook for not changing the political environment that continues to target queer kids. So you have Chris Christie of the Politics of HIB, the Harassment, Intimidation, and Bullying. He didn't want to sign it. This came in the wake of Tyler Clementi. Didn't want to sign it, so he grudgingly signs it, no press, nothing. And then when the Department of Education goes to implement HIB, have you seen those reports? Is it just like, if you've ever been in a car crash, a police report's like, what, a page, right? My brother died in a car crash, 5 pages. It's a 9-page incident report. So what principals are telling their teachers and their staff is, whatever you do, don't call it bullying. Because they don't have time to fill out a 9-page incident report. What I'm arguing is you've got Romer, Lawrence, Windsor, and Obergefell decisions which give LGBT people full citizenship rights. I mean, for an adult, it's a crazy happy time. Transgender people have yet to be covered by any of these decisions. So transgender people in some ways are like LGBT children. However, it's still legal in most states to discriminate against LGBT people, especially T people. And you have this situation in South Carolina, which I like to pick on, is that you can get married on Saturday, you'll be fired from your teaching job on Monday for being queer, and you'll be thrown out of your apartment on Tuesday. And there's really no legal recourse you have. Furthermore, queer kids remain political targets since none of these Supreme Court decisions have yet to be extended to queer youth. Oh, come on. Another way of seeing things is that the issues confronting queer youth, and especially queer youth who attend public school, are political, then political actions should improve their lives. So instead of saying, let's collect more data on how often queer kids are beat up, or if we want to do, a lot of the grants are for experimental data, so they don't shoot 50 kids in Vermont and 50 kids in Texas and see what queer kids in Texas and see what happens. No, that's silly. Let's just repeal the no promo homo laws embrace comprehensive and factual sexuality education, extend the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity, litigate under Romer, Lawrence, and Obergefell. I would also add, if you've got anti-bullying policies, make sure the categories are enumerated to include sexuality and gender identity, and that's all I got. Now you all get to play Torture the Professor. So, questions? Because I know that's a lot of 80 years of. Yes, ma'am.
I have one question that's just really sort of incidental, but when you were talking about Prop 6, was it, in California?
Yeah.
So is the wording that you had up there the actual wording of the...
John Briggs?
Like, do you or do you not want to allow homosexuals to have access to your children?
Yeah, he was the state senator. He's kind of nutty.
That's not the wording of the book.
No, that's not the wording of the proposition.
Okay.
No, that's what he said.
Yeah.
It was, it basically said anyone who is an avowed homosexual or those who, I'd have to look it up, but that's what he said in defense of it. Dr. Winkler. Yes.
So I have a question. I mean, this is a new area for me.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering what the literature is when you look at queer kids by ethnicity or race. What's the scholarship on that? I know that all of these incidents occur, but I'm guessing that there's variation.
There's a lot of variation, and you have like Lance McCready's work, where he'll look at GSAs, and what'll happen is that for African American kids, they see the GSAs as a white thing, and so the black queer kids won't go. But you also have this interesting development in urban schools, that urban schools, which largely serve kids of color, seem to be more protective of their queer kids. It's actually, one of the few times I can actually say there's an urban school advantage. So, but then it gets tied into state policy, so it's really idiosyncratic. And so that's about all I can tell you. And given my own methodological, I tend to be very anchored in looking at law and policies. And so that tends to be universalized, even though we know they're racialized. Sharon.
Cass, you talk a lot about youth, queer youth, but there's a large population of queer teachers and queer leaders out there who are afraid to be openly honest about their identity because of the ramifications, not only for their jobs, but also I certainly in the study of one of my doc students did, if you look at queer leaders, they really want to support kids because they know what they're going through, but they've had such terrible travesties happen to them. Like one school board member did a Photoshop of the queer superintendent and made sure that it got around the entire community, so that superintendent wasn't even the superintendent's partner, just found a way to deliberately target that person so that they were sacked by the board from their position. Mm-hmm. People going so far as superintendents and principals to have 2 separate mailing addresses and live at least 2 hours away from where they work so that they can't be physically seen anywhere within the education community that they serve, because they might, of course, they're going to taint the children, turn them over, and if you're working in my field, early childhood, they're definitely going to be sexual predators as well. Right. So I'm just wondering.
I do look at that. I do look at that in the book, but for here, I had to,
Right.
But it's interesting because there's some national data that out queer teachers and administrators are much better at protecting kids than the closeted ones. In fact, the closeted ones are less likely to protect queer kids because they're afraid of being assumed to be queer themselves, which is a real problem. I would say that in general, over your course of your career, it's actually in states like New Jersey, you're much better being out because then you can actually rebut it. I had a student who someone hated him as a superintendent. And so he and his husband have adopted kids and they called DIFUS on him. And just to be, assholish in the midst of, there was things going on at school.
Yeah.
Yes, that is. That's compliments of Queer Nation. But the fact that he was out to his board probably saved his job. Because of course, everybody had to hear it, everybody heard about the DIFUS investigation, even though they're supposed to be confidential. It was a real mess. Sally?
So, Doctor, I'm asking this more of I work with vulnerable populations too.
Yeah.
I work with refugees, and a lot of the material that I work with is equally depressing. You had to slog through suicide notes, and a lot of the critique that people who work with vulnerable populations get is they kind of get stuck on the depressing, right? Like you were talking about the AERA folks who are hyper emphasize this, these poor, depressed, transgendered folks.
Yeah.
And this is what sort of people do with refugees. They're like, these poor people who've lost everything, and then they get stuck there. How do you, as a scholar, sort of assist folks in moving past that and seeing the politicization of how they're continually being divested by us if we get stuck in this, these poor folks kind of thing? How do you deal with that? I feel like this is a constant. People even, at the GSC have been like, your data is really depressing. And I'm like,
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad that's what you're taking away from this.
Well, part of it is not to get depressed yourself.
Right, that's a whole other struggle.
But, but the other thing is, honestly, I abuse tenure.
Okay.
Tenure is a wonderful thing, particularly if you're working in areas like this. And so I just, until I retire, I'm going to be for God's sake, I'm going to be a burr in AERA's saddle. Because they're really latching on to this, these poor tortured queer kids who are depressed and killing themselves. Because there's money, there's research money for that.
Right.
There's not research money saying, well, this is a political framing,
Right.
and you've got to really get out and vote and attack the political framing, and then maybe the kids wouldn't be so depressed.
Right.
It's why when people come out, the first thing they say is, wow, my life just got a lot better. It might get harder, but the internal stuff stops. So, yeah. Matthew.
You talked about several good and bad actions and programs. I'm wondering, you mentioned child prevention briefly. Could you speak a little bit on the It Gets Better?
Oh!
And some of the...
Here's the problem with It Gets Better. It makes non-queer people feel really good about themselves because they can make a videotape and say, poor little queer kid, if you just suck it up for 2 to 7 more years in your homophobic school and graduate, it'll get better. You'll have political voice. Most days I really love Dan Savage, but that particular thing is framed to this poor, tortured queer youth. It's like, kids are getting bullied, but it's because of politics. Right. And Matthew.
Okay, I have a language question. If sort of across academia, advocacy groups, and then the larger public, how would you describe the current and evolving understanding or meaning and use of the word queer?
This is where my wife and I have ongoing battles. She came out in the 70s into lesbian liberation. I came out in the 90s into Queer Nation. Queer is really about recapturing a slur. And in my own research, I use queer as normative. And what do I mean is that everybody who's not queer is non-queer or somehow less, which I really like. Which, just irritates some of my senior colleagues at other institutions. I will say, because there's a body of literature, and now we've had this ongoing fight with AERA about the terminology where I was told not to use queer theory in the AERA handbook and LGBT issues. And I pointed out that queer legal theory had existed since 1995, and that was the framework we were using, and it was an academic study, and how, you know. But basically, if you're using it in an academic setting, talking about queer theory, and you're queer yourself, you're good. If you're non-queer, I would say you've got to use the long acronym, LGBT. Because depending on your audience, you might end up with a punch in the nose. Because it remains fighting words. Yeah, it's really, it is charged. But I deliberately use it partially, and this is out of queer legal theory, where I've been so frustrated by homophobic structures. It's like taking a 2x4 to somebody's head. So it's, I mean, my first big queer piece was Sissies, Faggots, Lesbies, and Dykes. That's about as subtle as a landmine. And I followed up with a piece called Thinking About Sodomy. So, you know, looking at the intersection of sodomy laws and licensure. Yes, sir, you've been so patient.
Thank you. Actually, before I ask my question, I would say sorry for my ignorance, because there are so many different things that I don't understand and I want to ask questions about, and I really don't need to step on any toes. First, the question is, what makes queer different from the rest of the other groups? Considering the acronyms you just called, and the next thing is that we are in the 21st century, and we don't know, you know, sexual identities can be very important. It's coming to prominence. I don't know when the law becomes so liberalized, when or how maybe say we can place in the law a particular framework, maybe for God society, because so many different groups are going to come up gradually. We can tell, and just considering how the law can deal with those different, you know, situations.
Well, you know, the law gives status, it gives recognition, but it also can stigmatize. And what we see in a society, the U.S., that was based on race-based slavery and race-based genocide with Native Americans, is that as you sit in these intersections of race, class, gender, the law will play out in different ways. So we know that LGBT kids of color are more likely to be arrested. White kids less so. The bullying varies on locale. So as you know, I'm all about liberation, the liberation of all people, which is kind of an old gay liberation front stance. Particularly kids who shouldn't have to endure crap to get a public education. But that's awfully hard to do in a race-based empire that has fear about homosexuality as a core theme to the empire. So, you know, I spent my last sabbatical in Canada, and what struck me is that they're two very different operating environments. Where in Canada, historically, the approach to queer people was, oh, you poor dear. Very polite, very Canadian, you poor dear. But it wasn't like the US where it's like, oh my God, it's a threat to the nation state, we're gonna be bombed. You know, the US is just much more hysterical about it. And that Margaret Kennedy's work actually looks at that in the nation state. Yes, ma'am.
Just like there's a lot of literature on, you know, how math has to be taught in schools, how a math curriculum should look. Is there any literature on how the comprehensive and factual sexual education, like you mentioned, that we need to have? Is there any literature on that in terms of the education perspective? For instance, is there in our GSC, is there a course, you know, for a health teacher to understand how she would teach, or is it the politics that prevents this literature?
Okay, well, I'm in administrative preparation, and I'm a former music teacher. So Lewis can probably talk about math. I'll put you on the spot. But in general, it depends on the school. And, you know, we have to be careful of essentialism. there's a lot of gender essentialism that's afloat, but girls learn this way, boys learn that way. And, if you look at identity and sexuality, it's much more complex, it's subtle. And as a queer theorist, I would say identity is a lot of gray, and it has then a lot of it's not just about sexual orientation, it's about race and class and gender. So how we construct our math learning groups, that's where you want to pay attention to social organization. Think like a sociologist. Yeah. Bill.
I was just going to say, there are places that actually do study sexuality education, and there is stuff known about what contributes to the kind of sexuality education that reduces teen pregnancy and things like that. There's an awful lot of moral education that gets in there and gets very complicated. I don't know how that relates to education about gays, homosexuals, and all these other categories.
Yeah.
But I do know we just don't have an health education department in the school, so
No.
we don't. It's part of a whole area.
Yeah, I mean, Gazette does a great job on sexuality education, and they run summer camps for public educators. But since the GSE doesn't have health ed, I can give you a dumb look.
And there are good private organizations in the state that deal with sexuality education.
Yeah, but what has happened is, from the beginning, sexuality education is what I call an HCF, high acuity factor topic, particularly for public school boards. That has historically been rather privatized, or has been deliberately taught in such a boring manner. I mean, I teach a course on sexuality, gender, and the politics of public schooling to undergrads, and it's a blast. But if you ask an undergraduate what their sex ed class was like in school, almost to a person, they go, and that's by design. It's about basic plumbing, and that's about it. Plumbing and diseases. What?
For heterosexuals.
Yeah,
We're only
yeah.
concerned about pregnancy.
That's right. It's and diseases, pregnancy prevention, and it's boring as all get out.
Okay, I'm gonna close, please join me in thanking Kath again.